Welcome to the English podcast for our autumn 2023 season, and today I'm joined by Clem and Ellie, who are third year students on the BA English course, and we're going to have a conversation about Matthew Gregory Lewis's 18th century Gothic novel, The Monk. The Monk was published in 1796, and just to give you a flavour of how it was first received, the British critic, writing that year, said that it included lust, murder, incest, and every atrocity that can disgrace human nature, brought together without the apology of probability or even possibility for their introduction. And we should warn listeners that this is a novel that really does, in good Gothic tradition, wander into a range of taboo areas and provocative areas. So we should warn readers that it does contain scenes of sexual violence and of matricide and of infant mortality. I think The Monk is a really good example of a Gothic novel. It comes out in the Gothic's inception, its heyday, from sort of the mid-18th century through to the end of the 19th century. And we've certainly looked and discussed this novel in class as an example of how Gothic really likes to wander into the outrageous and the deviant and the taboo to really sort of shake up the readership and challenge our preconceptions and ask us to look at things anew. And we thought that as the nights are getting darker now and as we move into the kind of winter season, it's a good time to visit some of these tales of horror and of terror that have really captured our reading imagination for the last 200 to 300 years. So, thank you Clem and Ellie for joining me today for this. And I think if we're just setting out a little bit of context for The Monk, so it's published in 1796. It was banned for some time, so we always like to do a banned book, don't we, really? I think in class, every time I say a book is being banned, we all get very excited. It was banned, and Lewis was accused of blasphemy and of lewdness, and he was taken to court. And he did recall the edition that was circulating at the time, and a kind of purged edition came out with all the kind of bits that people found problematic taken out. But it was hugely popular, and bit by bit, the original edition broke its way back through, and it's the edition that we are reading today. So, I'm going to start by asking you, Clem and Ellie, what do you think, in many ways, it's an odd novel in terms of the way it's written. Mm-hmm. So how do you think that the way the novel is written contributes to its kind of atmosphere of terror and of horror and the kind of spooky feeling it gives us?
So it definitely gives off vibes of Gothic imagery, like you've got descriptions of eerie settings like monasteries and crypts, and also desolate landscapes where ominous things take place, and such as supernatural elements. You get demonic figures and occult rituals that develop in these spooky atmospheres. And it also blurs the line between reality and the supernatural, adding to a sense of dread.
Yeah, because it just starts, doesn't it? It starts with Madrid, and we should say as well to our listeners that English Gothic writers in the 18th century always like to situate their novels in a kind of foreign country to make it sort of seem that this kind of thing couldn't possibly happen on British soil. And it's set in Madrid, that's where it starts. I think you made a really good point that it moves, doesn't it, from a very realistic setting, and suddenly this world of chaos opens up from within. Yeah.
Specifically going along the structure and how that it comes across in the novel, it's almost episodic in the sense that it will go from a set of characters to another set, really reveling in that pathos swing of like, oh yes, we are slowly building up that tension, and then the bathos comes in and we're swapped to another set of characters to almost let us down and not let us have that conclusion that's satisfying. We want to know what's happening with the monk and his relationships with the other monks and Matilda that appears before him, but then we suddenly switch to the Count and his friend, and now it's another story about a dead monk in an abbey, and just as that's building up, we go back to the monastery. It's a way of keeping, I'd say, readers on their toes, like they're not entirely sure what's going to happen next. Because as soon as the terror builds, it's immediately flatlined as we head to another location.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's real narrative uncertainty, isn't there, built into it. It doesn't give us, in many ways, that kind of single strand of narrative where we know where we're going. We keep moving around, and I think it deliberately disorientates us. And just as we get to a kind of moment of real tension and crisis, we suddenly dash to somebody else's narrative, and the whole mood kind of flattens again. So it's kind of like an early soap opera in that respect. It's kind of these heightened moments, and then you have to wait a few hundred pages before you get to the next. And I think too, there's quite, I don't know what you felt, there's quite a lot of folklore, isn't there, that's integrated as well, and stories within stories.
Yeah.
Is that something you think that's quite characteristic of the Gothic mode, that kind of building in these narrative layers?
I definitely would agree with that. You definitely have, like, theories such as the Gothic frame narrative, and this definitely, like, contributes towards the layers upon layers upon layers of stories and things that go on inside of the monk and the chaos that ensues.
Yeah, and when we think about, I suppose, that layering, there's that narrative layering. He includes a lot of German folklore, doesn't he, as well, and he borrows widely from other people's writing, which makes it seem quite a kind of mishmash of things. It's something that he's been criticised for, but also which I think makes it this really intriguing book. It's quite timeless in some ways. That narrative layering also sort of, I think, works out in terms of the setting too, doesn't it? Now, we've talked a lot when we discuss Gothic, and when we study Gothic, we talk about Gothic place and Gothic location, because nearly always Gothic events are giving a specific place to which to kind of unfold. What did you think about, we talked about it being set in Madrid, but what about the kind of settings, the Gothic place, as it were, in this novel? Do you think that it does create its own particular atmosphere of terror through where the actual action is set?
I would definitely say so. Like, even going back to the origins of the word Gothic, how it came from the Goths from Germany, like they were seen as barbaric by the ancient Romans. So it's that idea of, we have entered a holy place of worship, we have entered a monastery cathedral, and the fact that the devil has infiltrated the walls of what's meant to be the safest place for people of God. It's that perversion of the safe space. It's changing those areas where you are meant to feel the most secure and twisting it slightly just to set you on edge. And that is what the Gothic does best. It's putting you in locations that you're technically familiar with, that you technically would have had probably some experience with, even if it's just through other texts and readings and pictures, and then twisting the knife and making it just that little bit obscene.
Yeah. And I think too, I mean, I suppose we should say, for example, I've really got right into discussing this, which is fabulous, but the main character in this novel is a monk, and so therefore a lot of the setting is in monasteries and convents, as Elliot said, and it's basically about the demise, really, isn't it, of this monk who is a really good person, supposedly a sort of paragon of virtue, and then the novel sort of sees him going to absolute kind of outrageous decline, with a few side stories as well, which we will come back to as we go through.
It definitely helps to build tension between religious and profane spaces in the way that it explores tension between sacred and profane spaces, and it blurs the boundaries between the two, which contributes to moral ambiguity and eerie coexistence.
Yeah, and I think that, it's a really great way of saying it, is the blending of the sacred and the profane, and it does move between those, doesn't it? And you can understand in some respects why at the time this was seen as being a really provocative, what was kind of called a blasphemous text. I was thinking too, we talk a lot, don't we, in Gothic about the uncanny, and I was thinking about your point, Ellie, about how these convents and monasteries are meant to be these safe places, and yet it's where often these young women go and find themselves actually traumatised and violated, and they're not safe at all. Even the family home, of course, too, because the monk Ambrosio, who's at the centre of this, moves out of his monastery in his predatory ways bit by bit, doesn't he, and enters a domestic space too. So that idea of the uncanny, what Freud calls the unheimlich, where the kind of safe or the familiar becomes strange, is all part of the way this novel works as well, isn't it? So we've dealt with setting and we've dealt with the way that the novel is written. And I suppose, if we're talking about Gothic and spookiness and hauntings, we want, don't we? We want sort of a bit of supernatural thrown in there. And as we've discussed often in our Gothic module, we talk about the fact that as the Gothic develops from the 18th into the 19th century, we have these kind of two strands. One is known as the explained supernatural, which Anne Radcliffe is really a strong proponent of, where you have all your spooky effects, but it turns out there's a very straightforward explanation at the end of the novel. But then we have the Monk, where all this supernatural stuff is introduced and isn't explained away. So what for you, did you kind of feel that its supernatural elements were fairly convincing, fairly frightening? How do you feel Lewis uses the supernatural and how successfully?
I think with the amount of horror films that I've watched, it's not as frightening as it would have been back in the day when it was written.
Yeah.
But there was one particular moment in the novel that really pushed me, and that's right at the end when Ambrosio meets his fiery fate and is cast into the fiery abyss, which seems to underscore the theme of divine retribution.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, perhaps we'll come on when we get to the end of the novel to think about sort of the, who's in charge in this universe, because like you say, it seems to be a universe in which we've got apparitions of the devil several times throughout the novel and demons, and that seems to be in a way the mood, isn't it, the dominating mood, that it's a space that is occupied by some kind of moral vacuum really. Yeah, Ellie, did you have any thoughts on how the supernatural worked? Because Lewis's novel is very influential on later Gothic writers, isn't it, in allowing the supernatural not to be explained away, but to become a part of the Gothic world that we have to accept.
Very much so. I think it's successful because he draws on the folklore that is already existing around him. There's the intertextuality of the wandering Jew figure, of the nun, and the stories that he's heard from Germany. These religious profane texts of oh yes, if you do this you will burn in hellfire. Lewis has taken all of them and put them together to create a world where they all exist at the same time. And it's through that, it's yes, a Duke from Spain can experience a German haunting from a nun she was from somewhere else, I think she was from France, I can't remember off the top of my head, but from all over the globe, these little bits of supernaturalism are coming together to create a world where it's we can't explain it away because it just exists. And the fact that you haven't found it yet just means that you haven't found it yet.
Yeah. It lends itself to a great sort of psychoanalytical reading in that respect as well. And I know certainly some critics think that this kind of chaotic world in which supernatural appearances are coming in and out is sort of in some respects a kind of externalisation of the moral chaos inside the main characters. And we might talk about that a little bit further on as well. But yes, and there's also, you talked about the blending of the sacred and the profane, there's also that blending of the supernatural and the erotic, which I think is really disturbing in this novel. You mentioned the bleeding nun figure, which is a long sort of standing folkloric figure. But there's that moment, isn't there, in the coach where Don Raymond thinks he's actually escaping with his beloved Agnes, who's been put into a convent but is carrying his child, and it turns out, and he's hugging and caressing her, and it turns out actually it's just a skeleton that's there and just kind of taking his erotic embrace. So it's all very, very strange, isn't it? Shall we move on and think about the fact that probably the key supernatural figure, and perhaps one of the ones, sort of the figure that makes this novel most terrifying, is the appearance of the devil. And the devil kind of has twice comes into the novel, doesn't he? And I wonder sort of what you felt about the appearances of him, because he appears first, doesn't he, to tempt Ambrosio, and then he comes back at the end of the novel to punish him. What did you make of those two appearances of the devil? Very dramatic, very theatrical, which is a very theatrical novel, is it, in many ways, but did you feel that they added to the terror of the novel, and to its kind of rather morally ambiguous tone?
I definitely was repulsively fascinated, if that's even a term I can use, by his appearances, and like his role seems to caution us against succumbing to whatever he may put in our path, like temptation and moral corruption. And his ability to like shape shift also adds to the idea that evil can take on like any kind of different form. And in this way, like he tempts Ambrosio into sinful and wicked acts, which play into the traditional concept of the devil as a master of deception and temptation.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Did you have any thoughts on that, the way the devil appears and the function in the novel?
No, definitely. There's no quotes to hand at the moment, but when you first meet the devil, the way that Lewis describes him is very erotic, very over-sexualized. You are almost encouraged to lust over Satan, which, if anything, is just a juxtaposition in itself. But it's the thing of, yes, Satan is the lord of temptation. In a religious context, he will tempt you to do whatever he thinks will corrupt you and corrupt your soul. And it just so happens that with Ambrosio, it's that thing of, I've just discovered the world of lust. I've just discovered the world of bodily temptations. So Lucifer has appeared as a temptation in himself to be like, look at me and my form, look at this visage that I've put forward towards you, and you find it pleasing. What does that say about you if you find my body pleasing?
Yeah. And that moment when the devil first appears, Lucifer comes in, and this is when Ambrosio really is selling his soul to him, isn't he? Because he wants to be able to get his hands on Antonia, who he is lusting after, and he needs a way to do that. And when he does appear, first of all, he is naked, isn't he? He's described as a naked youth, but beautiful, glowing with a star on his forehead, beautiful skin, and Ambrosio is absolutely, there's a kind of erotic gaze, isn't there, that sort of travels all the way down the figure of Lucifer as he appears, therefore, and I think again we've talked, haven't we, about how again the Gothic moves into the taboo, and certainly in the late 18th century, the homoerotic had to be sort of disguised and codified and discussed in these kind of oblique ways. But there's certainly an erotic gaze that the reader is sort of forced to share, looking at the figure of the devil, which is quite perplexing. When he reappears, he takes on quite a different appearance, doesn't he? He's a shapeshifter very much, but rather than this beautiful naked youth, we have a figure that comes, I'm quoting here, he's got blasted limbs, a swarthy darkness, hands and feet have got talons, there's fury in his eyes, which would have struck even the bravest heart with terror. And he's got these two sable wings, and his hair's full of snakes at this point. So, any thoughts on why the devil kind of shapeshifts? He moves from the highly erotic to the kind of terrifying spectacle at the end.
Well, even at that point, as Britain became more secularised and moved away from religion, there was still very much that fear of damnation. There was still very much that fear of going to hell for your sins. So having him come forward at this later point, as you should imagine him, in quote marks, like you should imagine him as this fiend of fury that's disgusting to look at, swarthy, because back then anything dark was considered like unnatural. Like if you were fair and blonde haired, then you were beautiful. If you were dark and swarthy, then you were considered something of a I'm not going to say abomination because that's terrible, but you know what I mean, in the sense of it wasn't regarded as beautiful.
Yeah.
So now the devil has appeared as he should have appeared. It just happened that he tempted Ambrosio with his looks of youth.
Yes. So shall we just, and we could extend that discussion of the devil to Matilda, the figure of Rosario, Matilda. So this turns out to be a demon, so an extension of the devil. But first of all, he's appeared as a novice monk. That Ambrosio takes a kind of fatherly interest in, but then reappears as Matilda, who turns out to, and she's assumed the kind of image of the Virgin Mary, who is in one of the pictures that's hanging up in Ambrosio's monastic cell. And then that figure of the Madonna becomes again subject to a highly erotic gaze, isn't it, by Ambrosio, who sort of has erotic dreams about her, and then she's kind of made flesh in the demon form of Matilda. So I don't know, again, how do you respond to that kind of blurring again of the sacred and the profane? Because it happens, doesn't it, at the material level as well as in the kind of idea of actual place.
Definitely responded to it with a bit of shock when I first read it. Like, why is he sexualizing the Virgin Mary? Like, she's a Virgin Mary. But also, why is the devil tempting him with the Virgin Mary and his religion? Like, why? But also to teach him a lesson as well, isn't it?
Yeah, because he's very proud, isn't he?
Yeah.
And perhaps we should come on to Ambrosio now, because one of the big questions in the novel is about whether or not Ambrosio is in control of his fate. And whether or not he's a sympathetic figure. He does some terrible things, doesn't he? In addition to this kind of erotic drive that sort of takes all sorts of disturbing forms through the novel, he predates on Antonia, sexually assaults her and ultimately kills her, only to find out that she was his sister. And that in getting to her, he's killed her mother, who turned out to be his mother. He was separated, from his family at birth. So we've got this terrible set of crimes that pile up, and it seems that Ambrosio is a fairly unforgivable character by the end. Even the devil seems to think he's beyond any kind of salvation. But then again, has the devil been in charge of his fate all the way through? So it raises some really interesting questions about free will, doesn't it, and predeterminism that are kind of part, perhaps, of the philosophical debates of the age as well. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on whether Ambrosio is a sympathetic figure or not. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I definitely sympathised with him, like, right before he was tempted by Matilda. But as the novel progressed, I was like, why? What is this? The repulsion was strong, and like I couldn't find myself sympathising with him at the end. Like, he deserved his punishment, really. And he is presented as virtuous and pious, but he comes across as devout at the beginning, but at the end, after all of the plot has like crescendoed, I'm like, not anymore.
He goes too far, do you think?
He goes way too far. And like, I could construe this as like being fascinating, but it's repulsion as well as fascination once again.
Do you think he's a victim of, because we hear, don't we, that his desires have been repressed. We hear at one point that he's reached his 30s and that he doesn't have any idea about sort of sex and that he's very virtuous. And then suddenly, when he's tempted by the demon Matilda, who appears to him in the image of the Virgin Mary, then it's as if all his desires are kind of let rip, aren't they? So what do you think do you think it is a novel that talks to us about the nature of desire and how we are kind of desiring creatures, and that perhaps in the Enlightenment era, when this novel's written, and everybody's prioritising reason and the idea that we have to put faith in the human spirit and in human endeavours to solve all our problems. Do you think this novel slightly complicates that idea that human beings, can control themselves and can order their own sort of societies and construct their own moral order? Any thoughts on the role of desire in the novel, and the kind of faith in humanity that exploded, do you think, by the end?
See Lewis's monastery as almost an allegorical metaphor for society. Ambrosio is repressed by the church, but that just means that the everyman and his desires are repressed by society. It's not until he's tempted by something that he then starts going down a path. Because even at the time, sexuality, even between a man and a woman, was considered to just be a job, to make children, and it wasn't necessarily like a thing for enjoyment as it could be in the more modern era. So the thing of, even Lewis, there's the debate of his homosexuality, which he obviously had to repress as it was illegal at the time.
Yeah.
It's society repressing desire until that repression becomes too much and it explodes outwards. I personally think that what he does with Matilda in the monastery isn't necessarily reprehensible. all he did was discover desires and discovers like some part of his sexuality. Like, I enjoy this as a thing, as connection, whatever else. It's then when he lusts after Antonia to the point of, I'm going to kill her mother, I'm going to voyeuristically watch her through the window as she has a bath, I'm going to do this, and this, I'm going to like kill this person, I'm going to plot to do this. That then becomes a thing of like, okay, you are no longer redeemable because you've gone from here to here in the process of that arc. You are no longer redeemable and you've gone past the point of saving.
Yeah. And we talked about the idea of the monster and monstrosity, and how sometimes in these Gothic novels, actually what they're saying is you don't have to externalise your monsters, they're kind of inside you, as it were, the sort of internalised states of monstrosity that just need the right kind of conditions to seep out. Before we kind of come to perhaps a final sort of thought about the novel's achievement, I'm just wondering that, we've got these victims along the way, and there's another, Ambrosio, pursuing his own lust and his own desires, kind of leaves a sort of wreck, doesn't he, of broken lives along the way, including that of Agnes, the young girl who's been put in the convent by her family, but is in love with Don Raymond and carries his child secretly, and once her pregnancy is discovered, she's, sent into the vaults, isn't she? And I wondered, again, we're back to Gothic plays. There's a lot of the kind of really sort of the erotism of the novel happens sometimes in these sacred places or in the vaults or amidst dead bodies too. I don't know what you thought about Agnes as that kind of other side story, the young woman who has to then give birth alone in the vaults and has to kind of watch her own infant die, and then is given a chance, a sort of a redeemed chance, she's released and she can kind of live again. But do you think Lewis is piling on the kind of, the grief, the horror, the grotesquerie, because he talks, doesn't he, about having to bring her out, holding her baby who's already started to decompose in her arms. I mean, he does push, doesn't he, the boundaries. Do you think that's necessary to the kind of universe he's showing us, or do you think this is just Lewis pushing the Gothic a bit too far?
I definitely agree he is pushing the Gothic a little bit too far, but it also brings into light the lengths that you could say this is Gothic and how society would interpret the death of an innocent child at the end of the day.
Yeah, so some kind of emotional sort of pull as well. And I think you're right, Lewis is certainly seeing how far the Gothic can be pushed. It's a new type of genre, and he's seeing how much can I get away with here in terms of exploring, I suppose, some of the horrors and terrors of human existence and human behaviour as well. So perhaps we should move to thinking about what the novel achieves, because often in Gothic novels there's a kind of opening up of a world of excess and of what might be considered deviance by the sort of standards of the day, and then you have to put everything back in order, don't you? Because the novel has to show that kind of behaviour, those desires, those people have to be somehow expelled, and then we have to kind of impose some kind of moral order and some kind of convention back onto things so that we all feel safe. Do you think the monk does that? Do you think it offers us the view of a world that is ultimately redeemed, or do you think it leaves us with some fairly stark kind of comments on human nature and the future of humanity?
It definitely leaves a lot of questions unanswered and things unexplained, but it does also force us to grapple with the complexities of human nature and the consequences of giving into temptation and corruption at the end of the day.
Yeah, with no sort of simple or easy answers right at the end.
Yeah.
Ellie, do you have any thoughts about whether it's a hopeful world that we're left with at the end, or one that's a rather pessimistic worldview?
I think on the whole it is more pessimistic, but it does give you those grains of light with Don Raymond and Agnes, and with Ferdinand and the other nun that he finds, Virginia.
Lorenzo Virginia at the end, yes. Yeah.
So it's you can find your happy ending and you can find happiness, but you have to find it in a world full of all of these things. Because Lewis is essentially saying, like, you can't get away from the themes of this book. You can't get away from the imagery of this book because these are themes that are just in our society. Like, what happened to Agnes, unfortunately, isn't a story that was that uncommon. There would have been unmarried women holding their born babies being like, or even born.
Yeah. And those institutions, in the end, I mean, there's a lot of criticism, isn't there, about those institutions of family, of church, of state, who seem to fail these individuals. People like Agnes and Lorenzo and Don Raymond, who are relative innocents in the scheme of things. I suppose, too, in the end, one of the questions is, it's a novel, we have a kind of Faustian end, don't we, where Ambrosio has sold his soul to the devil early on, and he's caught by the Inquisition, and he's kind of given a way out by the devil, but he never ever, there never seems to be any, in Dr. Faustus you get a good angel and a bad angel, and they're both tempting Faustus and saying, no, listen to me. There's no good angel, is there, in The Monk? I mean, it seems to me it's a universe in which the divine, or the concept of the divine, is completely absent. The devil seems to have full sway and full moral authority. That's quite daring and risky as well, isn't it? But again, I don't know what you make of that. Do you feel that is sort of a sense? Is there any sense that this is a world which can be saved by anything other than human nature, or that somehow we have to make the best of a bad job, I suppose?
I think for the world of a monk, there is a chance at human redemption, saving what little good there is left inside of society, and to move away from the theme of God, from the thing of God and religion, and have self-control and self-determination at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that little group of four that are left standing, there's a sense, isn't it, that this is perhaps a new moral order. These are the ones, they're not the tyrannical parents, they're not the kind of the monks and the nuns who have kind of persecuted them. It's this sense that we're going to have to build what we can from the best of human nature, however that is. Whereas poor Ambrosio is taken up and hurled, isn't he, as you say, into the abyss, and certainly has no sense of redemption. Well, any final thoughts on our... Shall we cheer our listeners up before we move away from our podcast today? Is there anything remotely positive we can take from the book?
I think we can take Don Ramon as something that is positive from the book, because he isn't a man of God, he isn't connected to the church in any way, he is just a Spanish nobleman, but he does everything right. He meets a girl, they fall in love naturally, he waits for parental permission before they do anything. When she's shipped off to the convent, he finds her, and yes, they technically have premarital dalliances in the garden, but he fully goes to the Pope and does everything right and correct and orderly to then get to the end of the novel where he is married to the girl that he loves. And yes, there is the unfortunate circumstances of the child dying in between all of that, but by the end of the novel, the one person that did everything by the book and as society would have wanted him to do it, he's ended up happily married at the end.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I don't think I can top that.
I think we'll leave it on that very happy ending in a novel that gives us little else to feel hopeful perhaps about. But yeah, we hope that we've interested our listeners in perhaps going and exploring this wonderful novel, which is still the subject of much critical debate today, and certainly set the Gothic on a whole new exciting trajectory into the 19th century. Thank you all for listening. Thanks, Clem and Ellie.
Thank you for
Thank you.